Hello, everyone. So, welcome back from spring break. I hope that it was restful, enjoyable, whatever adjective you want to put on it. So, this is our second and final week focusing specifically on psilocybin. So, we'll be talking about alcohol use disorder, which has been studied most prominently, relapse prevention, and then special populations, just ones that maybe don't fit neatly into a category, before we move into MDMA and then ketamine over the next several weeks. Okay, so first chapter that we read from the text around classic psychedelics for the treatment of alcohol use disorder, or AUD. All right. So this is we're talking about this from a public health standpoint. And the authors of this chapter open by positioning alcohol as arguably the most damaging misused substance in the US and globally, not only because of medical harms, but because it affects families, communities, workplaces, and health systems at scale. So they cite estimates that around 12% of people in the US meet criteria for AUD at some point in their lifetime, which is a striking base rate for something that is really culturally normalized. They also highlight alcohol's contribution to global disability adjusted life years, including a substantial share of neuropsychiatric dailies, meaning alcohol isn't only liver disease or accidents, it is deeply tied to psychiatric disability, functioning, and chronic impairment. And finally, they emphasize the economic burden with a figure in the order of $185 billion annually in the US. So, this is one of the key arguments for innovation. The magnitude of harm is large enough that even modest improvements in treatment effectiveness matter. So then the authors set up the rationale for psychedelic assisted approaches by being very direct about the limitations of existing treatments. So we have medications and behavioral interventions that help some people, but overall, effect sizes tend to be small to moderate and relapse rates remain high. The authors note that a common pattern in AUD outcome research is roughly one third may achieve abstinence or remission in the first year after treatment, but many of those individuals relapse over time. They also point out that even when we combine multiple treatment modalities, so for example, medication plus therapy plus brief interventions, the added benefit often looks limited. So the logic here isn't, quote, nothing works. It's that it's that what we have doesn't reliably create durable change for enough people. And the public health burden is too big to accept incremental gains alone. So then the authors moved to history. So after LSD's psychoactive effects were discovered in the 1940s, the 1950s through the early 1970s saw an explosion of clinical and experimental work. In addition, the main emphasis was LSD for alcohol use disorder. That's important. Psychedelic assisted addiction treatment is not brand new. It has a long history that was interrupted. Then the research largely stopped in the early 1970s, and the authors framed the past decade as a major restart with early stage trials of psilocybin for addiction, things like nicotine, alcohol, and cocaine, which is what I was a part of, alongside broader clinical interest in depression and cancer related distress. So, this sets up a key theme. We're revisiting older clinical questions with modern methods, clearer ethics, improved screening, and better measurement. So, before getting into mechanisms, the authors highlight naturalistic and sacramental contexts. They summarize observational literature suggesting that ritual or religious use of classic psychedelics like peyote and ayahuasca has been associated in some studies with lower disordered substance use and few detrimental effects. At the same time, the chapter is careful. Observational findings are not proof of efficacy, they are selection effects, contextual factors, and cultural meaning systems that matter. They also emphasize safety. In controlled clinical settings, psilocybin and LSD have a relatively well documented safety profile when participants are carefully screened and supported. That matters because the whole model depends on being able to administer these medicines in a contained therapeutic frame. So here the authors define classic psychedelics, which is not as straightforward as it sounds. I know we've covered it before and we'll do it again. Their working definition has three features. These compounds reliably produce alterations in perception, cognition, affect meaning, and/or sense of self. They share similar discriminative stimulus effects, and importantly, they exert primary actions through serotonin 5-HT2A receptor agonism. The chapter focuses on LSD and psilocybin because those have the strongest clinical research relevance for AUD, but it also discusses DPT, ayahuasca, and peyote as related compounds or traditions that inform the broader picture. So this we're transitioning into into the mechanistic core of the chapter. So the authors emphasize that the acute subjective effects of classic psychedelics are strongly tied to 5-HT2A receptor activation. In humans, giving a 5-HT2A can block the subjective effects of psilocybin. They also cite evidence that subjective intensity correlates with receptor occupancy by psilocin, which is psilocybin's active metabolite. But they immediately complicate the story. 5-HT2A signaling isn't just one simple cascade. Yes, there's the canonical PLC to IP3-DAG pathway leading to calcium mobilization, but the receptor shows ligand-dependent functional selectivity, meaning different psychedelics ligands may bias different signaling pathways, affect receptor trafficking, or influence endocytosis and recycling. Clinically, this matters because it suggests we shouldn't reduce therapeutic action to a single linear turn on receptor get outcome model. The chapter then scales up from receptors to networks. Using modern neuroimaging, researchers examine how psychedelics change brain connectivity and oscillations. The authors describe evidence that psychedelics affect cortico-striatio-thalamocortical feedback loops, which are involved in gating information and integrating neural activity across cortex processes tied to attention and conscious awareness. They reference findings often described as hyperfrontality, and more generally, a temporary destabilization or reconfiguring effect on brain network communication. One clinical implication they point toward is that even if these changes are acute, they may create conditions where psychotherapy has amplified impact because perception, meaning making, and self-referential processing are temporarily altered. So here, the authors focus on the default mode network and task positive network, one of the most discussed topics in psychedelic neuroscience. Psilocybin can reduce the usual segregation between internal self-referential processing and externally directed attention, contributing to experiences like intensified meaning, altered self-boundaries, and shifts in salience. They also discuss reduced oscillatory synchronization and a broader loosening or disruption of typical resting state organization. Importantly, LSD work suggests different connectivity changes map onto different subjective effects. Visual cortex connectivity relates to visual experiences, while parahippocampal region connectivity relates to ego dissolution and altered meaning. The chapter notes a key limitation. Most imaging findings are acute. The field is now trying to test what persists after the session and how that relates to behavior change. Now the chapter pivots to phenomenology. The authors emphasize that psychedelic subjective effects are difficult to describe and measure, and importantly, they're not always classic hallucinations. Often, they're distortions of perception and meaning, intensified emotion, and altered self-experience. They include a well-known description emphasizing that psychedelics can produce unusual states, similar to dreams or spiral exaltation, without typical features like disorientation, delirium, or amnesia. This helps you to avoid oversimplifying psychedelics as hallucinogens in the popular sense and instead focus on how these states reorganize meaning making. So now we're getting to what's concrete about measurement. The field relies on validated self-report instruments that can quantify different facets of the psychedelic experience. So this chapter describes the 5D ASC, which captures dimensions like oceanic boundlessness and dread of ego dissolution. The hallucinogen rating scale, which was developed in DMT studies and used across psychedelics with subscales including intensity, affect, cognition, and perception. The mystical experience questionnaire, which is central in many clinical trials because it captures unity, transcendence of time and space, sacredness, noetic quality, ineffability, and positive mood. The chapter notes both longer and shorter versions supported by factor analysis. And finally, newer measures that capture change relevant phenomena like emotional breakthrough and challenging effects. Clinically, these tools matter because subjective experience isn't just interesting, it's often correlated with outcomes. So, this is one of the strongest historical sections. The chapter summarizes that while individual LSD studies were mixed and often underpowered, a meta analysis across 6 randomized trials found a consistent signal favoring LSD over control conditions. So just wanting to highlight here, the model in these studies is often a single high dose psychedelic session, not daily medication. And in the meta-analysis, the proportion significantly improved was higher in the LSD condition than control at early follow-up, and the effect persisted at 6 months. So the authors are careful. This still isn't definitive evidence by modern standards, but it's strong enough to justify renewed clinical trials, especially because it suggests a durable effect from a limited number of administrations. So DPT is presented as a more limited, mixed evidence story. A pilot study reported improvements among those who completed follow-up, but then a later randomized trial did not show clear advantages in clinical outcomes compared to conventional treatment. And at 12 months, the conventional treatment group actually looked better. The authors highlight a core issue. These older trials often had very high dropout rates, both during treatment and at follow-up, making conclusions shaky. This is a great place for me to remind you how attrition can distort apparent effects, especially in addiction trials. So here is the contemporary bridge to the psilocybin era. The chapter describes a proof of concept study. So there were 10 participants with alcohol dependence that received a 12-week therapy protocol that included motivational enhancement therapy and dedicated preparation and debriefing sessions. Psilocybin was administered twice at weeks 4 and 8 at weight adjusted dosing. The key detail, which was drinking decreased modestly before psilocybin, but decreased significantly after the first psilocybin session, and improvements were maintained in follow-up. Then comes one of the most important mechanistic clues. The intensity of the first psilocybin session strongly predicted subsequent drinking reductions. This ties subjective experience to behavioral outcomes and sets up later slides on mechanisms that we'll talk about. The authors describe an ongoing randomized controlled design using diphenhydramine as an active control. Importantly, because expectancy and blinding are major challenges in psychedelics trials, as we have discussed, they also describe the qualitative diversity of meaningful experiences reported by participants. This is clinically important. Not all therapeutic change is mediated by a single mystical template. People describe autobiographical processing, catharsis, intense struggle, forgiveness, love, and meaning shifts. This diversity is a strong fit with systemic and relational clinical sensibilities that change may come through different pathways depending on the person, their history, their relational world, and the therapeutic container. Ayahuasca is framed as widely used in ceremonial and some treatment contexts, but still lacking controlled efficacy trials for AUD. The chapter summarizes observational work showing low rates of AUD in some religious communities and suggests possible protective associations. But the authors include nuance. In at least one large online survey, ayahuasca users did not uniformly look better than non-users on alcohol screening scores. Rather, patterns suggested that outcomes likely depend on context, intention, and environment. This is one of the most teachable moments for you, is that psychedelics are not simply pharmacology, they're pharmacology plus meaning systems, rituals, community, and therapeutic framing. So this slide can be looked at as really holding cultural humility and care. The authors note a long-standing belief, particularly in the Native American church context, that peyote ceremonies can support sobriety. They mention proposed mechanisms like cathartic experience, self-understanding, and increased motivation. At the same time, the chapter notes a lack of published quantitative studies on alcohol use among the Native American church members. So this is a useful distinction, honoring the reported value and lived tradition while also being clear about the limits of the biomedical evidence base. So now the chapter organizes possible mechanisms. One hypothesis is receptor level adaptation. Classic psychedelics can induce tolerance and are associated in animal models that with downregulation of cortical 5-HT2A receptors. The authors point to receptor trafficking work suggesting psychedelic ligands may alter how receptors internalize and recycle in ways that endogenous serotonin does not. They then connect this to AUD clinically by noting that increased 5-HT2A binding has been associated with anxiety and stress coping difficulties, both linked to relapse risk, so downregulation could theoretically be therapeutic. But they also acknowledge an important counterpoint. If 5-HT2A downregulation were sufficient, then 5-HT2A antagonists alone would consistently reduce drinking in humans, and clinical trials have been mixed. So receptor modulation might be part of the story, but not the whole story. So this slide emphasizes polypharmacology and receptor crosstalk. The authors describe how classic psychedelics also act at 5-HT2C and some at 5-HT1A, which may shape both acute experience and downstream therapeutic change. They highlight glutamate involvement, especially MGLUR2, with evidence in animal proxy measures that MGLUR2 and agonism can attenuate psychedelic-like effects, and antagonism can potentiate them. They also note the possibility of receptor heterodimers or complexes, 5-HT2A with MGLUR2 and 5-HT2A with dopamine D2. LSD's partial D2 agonism is noted as contributing to a second phase of acute effects. The larger takeaway is that mechanisms likely involve multiple receptors and network level effects, not a single magic receptor. So this is one of the most clinically compelling mechanistic frames. The chapter proposes that psychedelics may induce a temporary state of enhanced neuroplastic potential, possibly through intracellular signaling and neurotropic factors like BDNF. They connect this to the concept of metaplasticity. That's the idea that the brain's threshold for change can itself change. If addiction involves maladaptive learning and entrenched patterns, then a psychedelic session may create a time-limited window where the system is more able to reorganize. And this is where the psychotherapy container becomes central. If the brain is more malleable than set and setting, intentions, safety, relational support, and meaning making, this could strongly shape what gets learned or rewritten during that window. Now the chapter addresses the most talked about mechanism, the subjective experience itself. Multiple clinical trials show correlations between measures like MEQ, mystical experience scores, and outcomes, reduced drinking, smoking cessation success, and reductions in the anxiety and depression in cancer-related distress. However, the authors also point to animal findings where psychedelic administration affects alcohol consumption, suggesting subjective experience may not fully explain therapeutic effects. So they name the open question: what is the subjective experience a causal mediator, or is it a proximal indicator of other processes happening in the brain and psyche? So this is a good place to remind you to hold a both and. So the subjective experience may be part of the causal pathway in humans, especially given meaning making and behavior change, but biology likely also contributes directly. So this slide focuses on longer term psychological changes that might support recovery. Changes like increased openness, shifts in mood, cognition, and potentially relational functioning. The chapter notes findings that a single high dose psilocybin session can increase openness, which is striking given how stable personality traits are typically considered. They also describe observational patterns in ayahuasca using religious communities that suggest improved functioning and lower current AUD prevalence in some samples. And they mention correlational work linking psychedelic use to lower correctional supervision failure. These aren't definitive mechanisms, but they point to plausible longer term changes in personality and behavior that could indirectly support sustained recovery. The authors explicitly argue against any overly simplistic mechanism story. Psychedelic effects likely emerge from multiple receptor targets, multiple signaling pathways, and large scale network changes interacting with psychological and social contexts. They point out that set and setting are widely accepted clinically but understudied scientifically. So for y'all, this is where you can integrate systemic thinking. The medicine effect is not separable from meaning systems, relationships, and the therapeutic frame. The authors are basically saying that the mechanism isn't just pharmacology, it's pharmacology embedded in context. So the conclusion synthesizes the argument given, or the argument. Given AUD's burden and limitations of existing treatments, classic psychedelics are a compelling area for development. The evidence is promising, but still early, except perhaps the LSD meta-analytic signal, which is historically robust enough to warrant renewed trials. They emphasize what's unique here. Unlike chronic daily pharmacotherapy, psychedelics might offer a model where one or a small number of sessions catalyze durable change. That's a fundamentally different paradigm. Future directions include better efficacy trials, clearer mechanism studies, psychological mediators, biomarkers, genetics and epigenetics, and neuroimaging, and careful work on how to optimally integrate psychedelics with psychosocial treatment. So finally, they stress safety. If this becomes more widely used clinically, careful screening, preparation, in-session support, and follow-up are not optional. They're part of the treatment. All right, then moving to our next reading, Mystical and Religious Experiences with Psychedelics. So this chapter is making a bold claim right from the beginning. Experiences people describe as sacred, holy, awe-filled, or mystical are not rare anomalies confined to clergy or religious people. They show up across human history, across major religions, and often in people who don't identify as religious at all. Richards is also the author, is also setting up a bridge between spirituality and clinical science. He's not just interested in these states because they're beautiful or culturally important. He argues they may have therapeutic significance, including in addictions, depression, anxiety, and especially in how people approach death and dying. So this chapter is about phenomenology and meaning, but it's also about clinical implications. Richards offers a tantalizing clue that's meant to keep the door open for a bioscientific account of these experiences. Humans naturally produce dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, generally in minute quantity, or I'm sorry, minute quantities. His point is not DMT explains religion, it's more modest and speculative. If the body can produce a psychedelic like compound, perhaps some spontaneous experiences, those that occur without substances, could share overlapping neurological or biochemical substrates with psychedelic experiences. He's also honest about epistemic limits. Consciousness is still enigmatic. This chapter consistently moves between curiosity and humility, suggesting hypotheses while acknowledging we don't have the definitive explanations. So, a key organizing move in this chapter is Richard's continuum of altered states with religious import. He's saying don't treat mystical experience as one single thing. He lays out four broad domains. First, our perceptual and aesthetic enhancements. Life looks more vivid, meaningful, and beautiful. Second, our psychodynamic experiences. These are intense emotional processing, such as guilt, grief, and anger, often culminating in relief, forgiveness, and a felt sense of a new beginning. Third, our visionary and archetypal experiences, where transpersonal imagery appears, things like gods, demons, mythic figures, and symbolic realms. And fourth is a complete mystical consciousness, a unitive state often framed as ego death, followed by unity and then reintegration. Clinically, this matters because different people may have different kinds of sessions, and different session types may support change through different pathways. Richard emphasizes that psychedelic facilitation is only one route into these states. Similar experiences are reported via meditation practices, fasting, sleep deprivation, intense athletic feats, artistic performance, childbirth, and sensory deprivation or overload. He links this to Maslow's concept of peak experience and to older scholarship in psychology of religion, so William James and others, who describe revelation-like states as part of the normal range of human consciousness. So here, a point for you is that psychedelics may be an intensifier or catalyst, but the territory is human consciousness itself. Richards highlights a classic feature. When people are in these states, they commonly feel that something true is being revealed, something deeper than everyday cognition. In psychology of religion, this is often called the noetic quality, the sense that knowledge is being encountered, not just imagined. That can be inspiring, but it's also clinically delicate because felt truth isn't automatically factual truth. In treatment context, this means facilitators have to walk a line, validate the meaning and emotional reality of the experience without endorsing every interpretation as literal or objectively accurate. In the first domain, Richard gives vivid examples. Dead grass becomes golden, faces become radiant with wisdom, a tree is experienced as a living being rather than an object. He points out that this can happen with open eyes and even at relatively low doses. And it's not only visual. People describe entering into music, hearing nonverbal messages in sound, or feeling meaning communicated through aesthetic experience. Clinically, this can matter for AUD and other SUDs because addiction often narrows attention and reward. These experiences can reopen perception, value, gratitude, and the capacity to feel moved, sometimes a meaningful counterweight to anhedonia and despair. The second domain is very psychotherapy friendly. Richards notes that intense emotions such as grief, guilt, and anger can emerge with remarkable intensity, often culminating in relief and forgiveness. He connects this to both psychodynamic psychotherapy and to religious conversion traditions where emotional confession and release are central. He also introduces the psycholytic model, low to moderate dosing used repeatedly across sessions, with most content staying in the realm of the ego, meaning personal biography, things like childhood memories, conflicts, and relational wounds. For clinicians, the takeaway is that psychedelic work is not only about mystical unity, there's also a more traditional deep therapy use case, with psychedelics functioning as a catalyst for emotional access and catharsis. In the third domain, Richard describes the archetypal visionary realm, things like gods, goddesses, angels, demons, and dragons, precious gemstones, elaborate temples, and other civilizations. This is all imagery that feels more than imagination. He notes a particularly striking claim. Sometimes people report imagery from traditions they don't know, which has led some theorists to invoke Jung's concept of a collective unconscious, something like shared symbolic structures. Whether or not we endorse Jung literally, clinically, we can treat this as symbolic material, imagery that carries emotional and relational meaning, often linking to identity, fear, longing, power, and attachment themes. Richard's fourth domain is what many modern psychedelic researchers call complete mystical consciousness. He describes it in a classic arc, the death or dissolution of everyday ego structures, followed by unitive immersion in a realm beyond time and space, followed by a return or ego rebirth into ordinary life. It includes features also present in visionary states like sacred awe, ineffability, and profound emotion. But the distinguishing features are unity and a felt sense of intuitive knowledge. So for you, it's helpful to highlight that ego dissolution here isn't framed as annihilation. It's framed as a transition that often returns the person to selfhood with altered meaning, values, and relational orientation. Richard lists terms across religions that point towards similar unitive experiences. So, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and Taoist language. He uses this to support what some call the perennial philosophy, the idea that there may be a core mystical experience intrinsic to human consciousness, discovered and described in different cultural vocabularies over time. So we can look at this as a hypothesis rather than a fact. Psychedelic research is sometimes interpreted as supporting cross-cultural commonalities in experience, but the interpretation is debated. Still, it's a powerful framework for understanding why people across different backgrounds can have experiences that feel religiously meaningful, even outside formal religion. Richard uses a useful nuance. Unity can be approached in two ways. Internal unity tends to occur with eyes closed and relaxation. Self-referential awareness fades and consciousness expands into a unitive field. Then external unity tends to occur with open eyes. Sensory perception transforms until the boundary between observer and observed collapses and all is one becomes dominant. Clinically, this can help normalize different session styles. Some people have mostly inward journeys, others have outward oneness with nature experiences, and both are transformative. Richard surveys scholarship suggesting psychedelics may have been involved in some religious origins. Soma in Rigveda, Kaikion in mythic in Greek mysteries, and other candidates. He also notes long-standing indigenous use of peyote and psilocybin mushrooms as sacraments. It's important to look at this carefully. Some of these claims are highly contested and the quality of evidence varies, but Richard's broader point is that humans have repeatedly used technologies, sometimes substances, to facilitate revelatory states. For clinical learners, this history underscores that psychedelic experiences often come preloaded with cultural and spiritual interpretive frames, which clinicians need to handle respectfully and ethically. Richards describes an early phase of modern research where investigators underestimated set and setting. Unsurprisingly, participants often had frightening experiences, things like panic, paranoia, and confusion. Those outcomes led researchers to label psychedelics psychotomimetic, which is what we've talked about before, like replicating psychosis, as if they were producing a temporary psychosis. That framing then shaped early hypotheses, including the idea that an induced crisis might mimic delirium tremens or a hitting bottom experience that could motivate sobriety. This is a critical methodological lesson. If you ignore context, you misclassify the phenomenon. So this is one of the most clinically relevant parts of the chapter. Richard argues that as researchers recognized the importance of psychological set and physical and interpersonal setting, the nature of experiences shifted, fewer panic states, and more valued mystical type experiences. He's explicit that modern ethical practice requires 1, establishing rapport beforehand, 2, providing skillful, non-intrusive support during dosing, 3, offering integration help afterward. And he explains why. To relinquish ego control and move through intense states, especially those involving ego dissolution, people need to feel safe. Safety is not just physical, it's relational. Richard anchors therapeutic relevance in a pragmatic criterion: what follows afterward. William James emphasized evaluating mystical experiences by their fruits for life, how they shape behavior, values, relationships, and functioning over time. Walter Ponck built this into definitions of mystical consciousness. It isn't just a peak state, it includes persisting positive change. So Richards is arguing that regardless of metaphysical interpretation, if these experiences reliably produce durable beneficial changes, they have clinical significance. Richard distinguishes 2 therapeutic models. The psycholytic model uses low or moderate dosing across many sessions, sometimes frequent sessions over months, focused primarily on life history, emotional catharsis, and psychodynamic integration. This is accelerated psychotherapy, but still largely ego-based. And the psychedelic model uses higher dosing with fewer administrations, sometimes just 1 to 3, designed to facilitate transcendental or mystical states that can powerfully reorganize self-concept and meaning. He predicts future clinical work may integrate both rather than treating them as rivals. This slide is Richard's most explicitly addiction relevant. He describes common post-mystical shifts that map well onto recovery processes. People report a conviction of intrinsic worth, important because shame and self-contempt are relapse fuels. They report reduced estrangement and increased belonging. These are important because addiction often isolates. They report greater capacity for love and forgiveness, which is important because relational repair is central for many. And crucially, some report entering Alcoholics Anonymous's higher power, report encountering Alcoholics Anonymous's higher power, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. Whether we interpret that spiritually or psychologically, it can function as a profound motivational and stabilizing anchor for sobriety. Richards uses cancer distress studies as a flagship example of fruits for life. Participants reported decreases in depression and anxiety, but also deeper existential shifts, reduced fear of death, decreased preoccupation with pain, and increased capacity to nurture relationships. He emphasizes what's unique. Often this comes from one session or at most a few. That's not typical of pharmacotherapy models. From a training standpoint, this is where you can see how mystical type states might operate as a mechanism of existential reorientation, changing how a person holds suffering, mortality, and meaning. Richards is very clear that interpersonal support is not an optional extra. In practice, support is part of the intervention. Preparation shapes what the person expects and how they relate to fear. Guidance helps them surrender and navigate intensity, and integration helps convert insight into action. He also stresses non-intrusive support, meaning the guides are not directing the content, but providing safety, grounding, and permission to experience whatever arises. So for a clinician training, this slide can help you conceptualize psychedelic-assisted therapy as a structured relational container rather than a drug experience plus therapy afterward. All right, so finally, Richard looks beyond medicine. He suggests these states may have roles in education and religious practice and mentions early work exploring meditation enhancement and clergy training. Whether one agrees or not, the key point is that psychedelic research may contribute not only to treatment protocols, but also to broader questions about consciousness. So for this course, we can frame this as psychedelic science sits at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, spirituality, and ethics. So clinicians need conceptual sophistication and cultural humility. All right. So our next reading is one of the most influential modern psychedelic trials in addictions. So Bogenschutz and colleagues randomized controlled trial examining whether psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy improves drinking outcomes in adults with AUD. The key point is not that this is psilocybin alone. Everyone received a structured psychotherapy package, and the medication comparison is psilocybin versus an active placebo, which was diphenhydramine. The primary outcome is very specific and clinically meaningful. Percentage of heavy drinking days tracked across a long follow-up window after dosing. So the study's main question is straightforward. Does psilocybin-assisted treatment improve drinking outcomes relative to active placebo when both groups receive psychotherapy? So notice the structure. Participants engaged in 12 weeks of manualized psychotherapy, and within that treatment, they complete 2-day-long medication sessions around weeks 4, and 8. So conceptually, the investigators are testing whether psilocybin adds benefit over and above credible placebo condition plus therapy. So this is a double-blind randomized clinical trial conducted at 2 academic centers in the US. Participants were randomized 1-to-1 and followed across a 32-week double-blind period after the first medication session. Importantly, the comparison is not inert placebo, it's diphenhydramine, which can produce noticeable bodily effects and helps the study maintain a more believable blind, at least in theory. Eligibility included adults 25 to 65 with DSM-4 alcohol dependence and at least 4 heavy drinking days in the last 30 prior to screening. Exclusions matter clinically. People with major psychiatric disorders, significant drug use disorders, and recent hallucinogen use were excluded, along with medical contraindications and certain medications. So when we interpret results, we should remember these findings apply best to a carefully screened AUD sample. This is common in early efficacy trials, but it limits generalizability. Everybody received the same psychotherapy container, 12 sessions with a team of 2 therapists, including a licensed psychiatrist. The therapy included motivational interviewing and motivational enhancement and CBT for AUD, plus elements specifically designed to help participants navigate and use the psychoactive effects of the medication. This matters for this class because it highlights a core theme in psychedelic therapy. Medication is embedded in relationship, preparation, and meaning making, not delivered as a standalone pharmacologic intervention. The dosing strategy is carefully described. Session 1 used psilocybin at 25 milligrams per 70 kilograms versus 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine. This was the same dose that we used in the study that I was a part of. So for session 2, psilocybin could be between 25 to 40 milligrams per 70 kilograms, and diphenhydramine could be 50 to 100 milligrams depending on the protocol rules. Sessions were intensive, medication around 9 a.m. Participants stayed in the room with the therapist for at least 8 hours, and the setting included eye shades and headphones with a standardized music playlist, exactly what we did in our study. They also had medications available for things like hypertension, severe anxiety, and psychotic symptoms, which signals both safety planning and the reality that difficult reactions can happen. One of the most interesting design features is that the second dose of psilocybin was adjusted based on subjective response using the MEQ, or the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. If someone had a robust response, an MEQ total score of zero point 0.6 or higher, their second dose was set 30 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilograms. If their MEQ was below zero point 0.6, they received 40 milligrams per 70 kilograms in the second session. So the study operationalizes an idea many clinicians talk about. Intensity and quality of the acute experience may matter, and dosing can be adjusted to reliably occasion a therapeutic range of experience. The primary outcome was percentage of heavy drinking days, or PHDD, measured using a timeline follow back, which the authors described as a criterion standard as a criterion standard method in AUD trials. We also used a timeline follow back. Secondary outcomes included other continuous drinking variables and several clinically interpretable dichotomous endpoints like abstinence and reduction in WHO, like WHO drinking risk level. They also collected ethyl glucuronide in hair, just some like biomedical testing in hair or fingernails at weeks 24 as a partial objective check on abstinence reports, ETG. The trial randomized 95 participants and 93 received at least one dose and were included in the primary analysis. Clinically, this was a fairly severe sample on average. Participants had been alcohol dependent for at least 14 years, and baseline heavy drinking was common. Therapy participation was high and similar across groups, which helps interpret group differences as less likely due to differential dose of psychotherapy. Here's the headline result. During weeks 5 through 36, percentage of heavy drinking days was 9.7% in the psilocybin group compared to 23.6% in the diphenhydramine group. That's a mean difference of about 13.9 percentage points, which is statistically significant. So in practical terms, people receiving psilocybin plus psychotherapy had substantially fewer heavy drinking days over many months of follow-up than those receiving active placebo plus the same therapy. So beyond PHDD, the paper reports broader impacts. For example, the primary analysis showed an overall treatment effect on a multidimensional treatment outcome vector. They also found psilocybin participants were more likely to have no heavy drinking days and to show meaningful reductions in WHO risk level during the follow-up. And drinking-related problems measured by the short index of problems were lower in the psilocybin group at the final double-blind time point. So the effect isn't only about frequency of heavy drinking, but also aligns with functional and clinical change in alcohol-related consequences. A really important nuance. Both groups showed substantial improvement before randomization or first dose during the early therapy and preparation phase. This tells us two things. First, the psychotherapy package and the structured attempt to stop drinking ahead of dosing already produce meaningful early change. Second, the key question becomes, does psilocybin produce additional benefit after that initial improvement? The data suggest yes, because the group differences show up across the longer follow-up period after dosing. The subjective effects differences are dramatic. Mean MEQ scores after session 1 were 0.59 for psilocybin and 0.1 for diphenhydramine. After session 2, 0.64 versus 0.11. The authors explicitly interpret this as high average intensity in the psilocybin group and low intensity in the placebo group. So here in clinical trials, subjective effects are not a side detail. They are often hypothesized to be part of the therapeutic mechanism, and they also complicate blinding. This is one of the most discussed issues in modern psychedelic RCTs. Blinding did not hold well. Participants correctly guessed treatment assignment 93.6% of first sessions and 94.7% of second sessions with high certainty. We also rated this in our study. I'll be interested to see what the actual numbers are. Therapists also guess correctly at very high rates, over 92% for the first session and over 97% for the second session. So we have to treat this as both A, impressive efficacy data, and B, a reminder that expectancy, meaning, and unblinding may contribute to observed effects. This doesn't invalidate results, but it does shape how we interpret mechanism and how we design future trials. Safety is crucial, especially when we talk about scalability. Across the follow-up period, 204 adverse events were reported, more in the psilocybin group overall, but serious adverse events occurred only in the diphenhydramine group. In the psilocybin group, common acute issues included headache, which was reported in 43.8% after psilocybin compared to 4.4% after diphenhydramine. Anxiety and nausea were also more frequent during psilocybin sessions, and 2 participants received diazepam, 10 milligrams of it for anxiety during session 2, with resolution within minutes to a few hours. This is a concrete example of supportive containment plus rescue options. So the protocol anticipates distress reaction and includes a plan. Clinically, it's important we don't reduce this to a pill that cures AUD. The intervention is a whole package. There's manualized therapy, so motivational interviewing and CBT, intensive preparation, 2-day-long sessions with eye shades and music and therapist support, and follow-up integration style sessions. So the real world question becomes, what parts are essential? Is it the mystical type experience, the neurobiological plasticity window, the alliance and meaning making? Probably some combination of all of them. This RCT can't fully separate those ingredients, but it strongly suggests that psilocybin, in the psilocybin condition, within that container, it produces added benefit for many people. Then from an evidence-based practice lens, we should name limitations openly. The sample was predominantly non-Hispanic white, and the exclusion criteria removed many real-world complexities like comorbidity and broader substance use patterns. Second, the high correct guess rate underscores that maintaining a true blind is extremely difficult in psychedelic studies. Next up questions for the field include replication in larger and more diverse samples, improved control conditions, clearer mechanism measures, and eventually pragmatic effectiveness trials that test more real clinic populations and workflows. All right, our next reading. So psilocybin assisted therapy for relapse prevention and AUD. It's a phase 2 randomized control trial. Here we're reviewing a 2025 phase 2 randomized clinical trial examining psilocybin assisted therapy specifically for relapse prevention following alcohol withdrawal. This is important because it tests a different clinical question than prior psychedelic addiction studies. Rather than asking whether psilocybin reduces heavy drinking among active users, the study asks, can psilocybin prevent relapse after detoxification? This distinction is clinically and mechanistically significant. So relapse after withdrawal is the norm rather than the exception in AUD. Even with naltrexone and acamprosate, I always say that wrong. I say a lot of things wrong, as you guys can hear. Relapse rates remain high. Acamprosate, I don't know. Previous psychedelic trials, particularly Bogenschutz 2022, focused on reducing heavy drinking days in people who were still actively drinking. This study addresses a different population, individuals who are already abstinent after withdrawal. The clinical target shifts from reduction to maintenance of abstinence, which may involve different neural and behavioral processes. So the hypothesis was straightforward. Psilocybin recipients would demonstrate longer abstinence and lower alcohol use at 4 weeks compared to placebo. Relapse was defined as more than 1 standard unit per day, important because this distinguishes minor lapse from relapse. Primary endpoint was at 4 weeks follow-up, and their secondary endpoint was a 6-month follow-up. This is a relatively short-term primary outcome window compared to some addiction studies. The sample was small. 37 participants completed the 4-week follow-up. Most participants met criteria for severe AUD, which is clinically relevant. This is not a mild use population. Participants had completed withdrawal treatment within 6 weeks prior to enrollment. That means they were in early abstinence, a period characterized by high relapse vulnerability. Importantly, the study was underpowered due to COVID-related recruitment limitations. They initially aimed for 60 participants. This is a relatively brief intervention compared to prior trials, only one dosing session. Total psychotherapy time was approximately 5.5 hours. So you can compare that to Bogenschutz's study, which used 2 doses and 12 to 14 psychotherapy sessions. The treatment model was Brenda based, so psychoeducation, motivational enhancement, CBT elements, they were adapted for psychedelic support. So you must keep dosage intensity and therapy dose in mind when interpreting these outcomes. The core finding was there were no statistically significant differences between psilocybin and placebo at 4 weeks. The effect sizes were small. Kaplan-Meier survival analysis also showed no significant difference in relapse timing. Even at 6 months, no differences emerged. This is a null trial for alcohol use outcomes. This is scientifically important. The hazard ratio suggests a 22% lower relapse risk in the psilocybin group, but confidence intervals were wide and crossed unity. This means we cannot conclude efficacy. The authors appropriately caution interpretation due to limited power. However, the consistency of null findings across all alcohol measures suggests that this was not simply a power issue. Here's where the study becomes more nuanced. Psilocybin significantly improved several psychological measures. So depressive symptoms dropped below remission threshold, hopelessness decreased, expressive suppression decreased, and quality of life improved. Craving decreased in both groups at day 1, but more in the psilocybin group. Yet these psychological improvements did not translate into reduced relapse. This decoupling is clinically fascinating. This challenges the assumption that improving depression automatically reduces addiction behavior. Addiction is not reducible to mood disturbance alone. Relapse likely involves habit circuitry, cue reactivity, environmental reinforcement loops, social contexts, and behavioral conditioning. So psilocybin may shift internal states without sufficiently disrupting behavioral relapse pathways in severe AUD. Bogenschutz found reductions in heavy drinking days, but that study involved 2 psilocybin sessions, extensive psychotherapy, and active drinkers seeking reduction. This study targeted abstinent individuals trying to maintain sobriety. Reducing heavy drinking days and preventing relapse may involve different mechanisms. Preclinical work suggests psilocybin may reduce ongoing consumption, but not necessarily prevent reinstatement after abstinence. Blinding integrity was weak. Nearly all participants guessed correctly. This is a common challenge, as we've talked about. Interestingly, exploratory analysis suggested participants without prior psychedelic experience may have benefited more. This raises mechanistic questions about expectancy, tolerance, and novelty effects. Also, severity matters. This was a highly impaired group. The author suggests that a more resource-intensive approach may be required. Possibilities include repeated dosing sessions, more structured addiction-focused therapy, behavioral retraining, and adjunctive technologies like neurofeedback or VR. This study does not invalidate psychedelic therapy in AUD. It refines where and how it may work. So this is a sophisticated and responsible negative trial. This study reinforces the importance of precise outcome definitions, the need to differentiate between symptom change and behavioral change, and the necessity of tailoring psychedelic therapy models to specific clinical targets. It deepens, not diminishes the field. All right, and then our final reading expands on the conversation by examining psilocybin's role in AUD through a slightly different lens than the other authors. Um, so this paper helps us synthesize the clinical, psychological, and neurobiological questions raised throughout this week. So Luquins situates psilocybin within the broader addiction neuroscience literature. One of the key takeaways is that AUD is not a monolithic condition. It includes habit learning, stress reactivity, reward dysregulation, social reinforcement, and trauma histories. Psilocybin may interact differently with each of these domains. The authors emphasize the importance of precision when defining treatment targets. So rather than focusing exclusively on outcomes, this article examines mechanisms. Several candidate mechanisms are discussed: 5-HT2A receptor modulation, glutamatergic plasticity, network level disruption of rigid patterns, mystical type experiences, and enhanced cognitive flexibility. Importantly, the paper questions whether these mechanisms directly impact relapse circuitry. The authors draw from addiction neuroscience literature to remind us that relapse is strongly tied to conditioned cues, stress exposure, habit learning and dorsal striatum, and impaired prefrontal regulation. Psilocybin's known acute effects involve default mode network disruption, increased entropy, and emotional openness. So the question becomes, do these acute shifts meaningfully rewire habit-based relapse pathways? The evidence is not yet clear. Luquins, the author, reinforces a theme seen in early studies. Intensity of mystical type experiences often predicts mood outcomes, but addiction behavior may not be solely determined by existential transformation. A person can feel deeply connected, forgiven, and spiritually awakened, but still relapse when encountering conditioned cues. This complicates simplistic conversion experience models. The paper suggests that psilocybin may temporarily loosen rigid self-concepts, allow reframing of identity from addict to person capable of change, and facilitate catharsis of shame or trauma. However, these psychological processes likely require structured integration. Without sustained behavioral scaffolding, gains may dissipate. This aligns with what we saw in both of the other studies. A single dose with minimal integration may not be sufficient. Addiction is chronic and relapsing, and it may require iterative interventions rather than a single transformative event. The authors argue for more nuanced dosing paradigms and longer follow-up studies. Here is where this connects beautifully to our systemic and relational lens. Psilocybin sessions are conducted in safe, contained, supportive settings, and relapse occurs in real-world ecological systems. If environmental contingencies are not addressed, things like family dynamics, stressors, and attachment patterns, the psychedelic experience may not generalize behaviorally. This reinforces that addiction is embedded in relational systems. The authors caution against viewing psilocybin as a standalone cure. Instead, they suggest integration into multimodal frameworks. For example, integration with AA or community recovery, behavioral relapse rehearsal, family-based interventions, and stress reactivity training. Psychedelics may open a window of plasticity, but what fills that window matters. And then finally, for this week, this article pushes the field towards sophistication. Rather than asking, does psilocybin work? We must ask, for whom, at what stage, with what therapeutic scaffolding, and targeting which mechanisms. So for y'all, this is an invitation to this paper, this article is an invitation to think beyond enthusiasm and toward precision.